Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York. Our show from its inception has offered alternative narratives rooted in an imaginative radical tradition. We've offered critiques and analysis to the traditional storylines that have come to define the so-called political, economic, moral, intellectual, and spiritual reality of an ever-growing, dysfunctioning America. The competing and contradictory historical racial narratives of the American dream / nightmare have often been at the center of these critiques, expressed in the life experiences of ordinary Americans, whatever their color, race, or ethnicity. We're very happy to welcome to the show a veteran journalist, sometimes referred to by his colleagues as a certified elder of the Black journalism tribe. In the late 1970s, he launched America's Black Forum, a national black news TV program. In 1987, he launched the first nationally syndicated hip-hop music show called Wrap It Up. And in 2002, he co-founded the weekly political journal, Black Commentator. All of this gets started with our guest, the son of famed disc jockey Rudy the Deuce Rutherford, reading Newswire copy on the air at age 11 in 1958 in Columbus, Georgia. His father was the first black man to host a non-gospel television show in the Deep South. And if that's not enough, our guest's first full-time broadcast news job was on James Brown, Augusta, Georgia radio station in 1970, where the godfather of soul shortened his surname to Ford. He's the founder and executive editor of the critically acclaimed Black Agenda Report, news, information, and analysis from the Black Left. He's one of the major voices and thought-provoking visionaries of the Black Left. We've wanted him on the show for a long time, and we're thrilled he's here. And before we welcome Glen Ford in person to the Radical Imagination, we want to play a short clip of Richard Pryor, 40 years ago, nailing the connection between racism and capitalism.
What do you think that these executives are afraid you're going to do to white America?
Probably stop some racism.
Stop racism?
Yeah. I'm probably afraid of that, because then people don't hate each other, and people start talking to each other, and then they start talking to each other, they find out who's the problem.
Which is?
Greedy people.
Greedy. I have a couple things I want to ask you there. Do you really think that some of the guys that you've dealt with at NBC, no names, right? Because there's lawsuits for that too, that some of these guys really want to promote racism actively, or is it a subconscious?
I just think it's part of capitalism, is to promote racism, you know, right? In order to make things work. If you feel better because you're white and you can get a job, you use that. I mean, you know, I would.
Absolutely.
Say, I'm sorry, Jack, but shit, they say I'm white, I'm going to use this.
Right, absolutely.
Get this job, I'm hungry, you know. But, and that separates people. So they keep people separated, and that keeps them from thinking about the real problem. That's as simple as I see it. Probably it's not that simple, but...
Now, all right, you and I are about the same age, right? We're in our mid-30s. How long is it going to take before guys who think like you, and I say guys who think like me, people who don't want to have racism in the country, people who don't want to be oppressing any minority, whatever it is, sexual, whatever minority, really get into positions of power and can change things?
You can't get in a position of power, it seems, if you think like that. It seems that the only time you get in a position of power is if you're like the people that are in power. To me, I mean, that's the way it goes. I mean, people that get to become executives become like the people that were already executives.
I don't know, maybe...
They go in with good intentions, but it eats them up. It's like a cesspool, you know, it just gets on you and it starts eating.
The system levels them.
Pretty soon it's all gone.
Is that what a cesspool sounds like?
Yes. Yeah.
All right, we'll be back right after this.
Okay.
What do you...
All right. Well, we're here. Are we in the cesspool of the system?
Oh, the system has been a cesspool for a very, very long time. It is the mother of all cesspools.
The mother of all cesspools.
Aspiring cesspools have researched the United States to see what a grown-up cesspool acts like and looks like.
Real cesspools.
A real model of the worst kind.
And you've been doing this for a long time. You have, so many different shows, Black Agenda Report. If our audience, some of our audience may not be familiar with your work, if they tuned in, what should they expect? What is the Black Left? What are you attempting to get across on the airways?
Well, the truth is, like every other political tendency, me and those around me, we seek to define what the Black Left is. That really is what folks in the political world are doing constantly. They claim the mantle of the left or progressive or whatever that mantle is, and they set about defining it by their approach to the realities as it unfolds. So, you know, politics is an argument, and Black liberation is something that certainly is worth arguing about strongly all the time.
As Richie Havens tried to point out.
That's freedom, freedom,
Freedom,
freedom,
liberation.
freedom.
Absolutely.
Let's not change the subject. But what does freedom mean? What does it mean in terms of the search for freedom? What does it mean we should be doing today? How should we be looking at the unfolding reality? What dangers and opportunities are present? Every movement that is worthy of being called a movement has folks whose job it is to do analysis. It should not be divorced, certainly, from work, from practice, from organizing people, but without analysis, you don't have a running discussion of what the unfolding reality means and what we should do, about it.
Exactly.
And so we looked at the Black political scene and saw that there were great holes in our analytical armory.
That's what you've chosen to focus on in particular. Yes, okay. And chinks in the armor, what does that mean? The misleadership
and you know,
class?
It really is important if we are talking about Black liberation, self-determination, a people being, that all the people of the world own the world, have something to say about everything in the world, that the whole history of the human race is our common patrimony. And
universal.
So yes, and it is therefore important that Black analysis go beyond what many of us used to call derisively ghetto politics. That is, it was acceptable for Black folks to talk about inner city dynamics politically and economically, but to leave the rest of the world to white folks. Foreign policy was white folks' land unless it dealt directly with Africa. But white analysis was universal, and Black American analysis was ghettoized. And we reject that. And that's why we talk about Syria. We talk about, well, whatever seems to be troubling mankind. And it's our obligation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as you were just talking there, Martin Luther King's famous anti-Vietnam speech, where he got really ripped apart from both the white and Black communities for going beyond what
he was excoriated for stepping out of his lane, and as if we have a lane. And that, of course, is a relic of segregation, of Jim Crow. They try to Jim Crow our politics. And many Black folks, some of whom consider themselves to be quite militant, actually enjoy being in that lane. They feel that they're masters of that lane. And
that's their brand.
That's their brand. Yeah, and it's marketing. It's not making transformation. Yeah,
I mean, you have been highly critical of that in particular the black leadership, misleadership class. And that, of course, as you're pointing out, goes way back in history, right?
Yeah, and we coined that term, black misleadership class,
Yeah.
which is admittedly not a scientific term, although it has great usefulness, because we saw it as a weapon in the struggle against those agents of the larger oppressor class who are black. That's what the black misleadership class is. That's why they mislead people. They are seeking to advance their own narrow agenda, which is, in their eyes, not in contradiction to that of the ruling class in the United States. They see black progress as their own narrowly based classes' progress. They are obsessed with counting black faces in high places. They don't seek transformation of society. They simply want blacks to be represented at all levels of society, in not just in the electoral arena or in corporations or in the military, but even to be the most respected gangsters in the world. As long as blacks are represented, then they're quite happy. And
more fully in the American dream than it's in fact working. Is this
in fact, in many ways, by doing that, they idealize all of the inequalities and faults and injustices of American society. Yes.
So this is not exclusively, but it sounds like primarily at this level, conversation you have with black leadership and the black bourgeoisie, if you will, right? Is that basically who you're trying to have a conversation with? Well, raise consciousness, or what?
Sure, and to define what we mean by leadership.
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example, because I know that you wanted to touch on some of my experiences back in the long ago days.
I do.
Working for James Brown.
Right.
When I got my first paying job after getting out of the Army in 1970. I went to WRDW radio in Augusta, Georgia. The station manager pointed out where my recording equipment was, where the Associated Press news wire was, all of the details of the little newsroom. And then he pointed to a piece of paper that was stuck on the wall, and he said, if you need reaction from local community leaders to anything that comes across the wire, there's a list right there of the most important black folks in town. Call them, their phone numbers are there. I said,
that's the accepted group that you were
that's what
to talk to.
Yes, and I said, okay, boss. And as soon as he left the room, I checked out the list, and it was totally comprised of Reverend this, Reverend Doctor that, and even a couple of bishops were on the list. It was a theocratic list. And the first thing I did was to take that list off of the wall and crumble it up and throw it into the waste basket. And I spent the next 10 days, 2 weeks, immersing myself in Black Augusta to find out who the real grassroots leaders of Augusta were. The first stop I made was to the public housing projects, because I knew that in these projects there was a large and rather loud black woman who was actually the leader of those tenants. And I'd never met her, but I knew she was there because she's always there.
Right.
And she became my contact on housing and on poor people and their economic plight in general. And I knew that there was always a brother who jumped up and started hollering every time the police beat down another black person. And I found him too, of course, because he is always there in every black community. And that person became my contact on the criminal justice system, and on down the line. I knew.
A little more personal. How did this all get started? You were a young kid. Was this natural to you to do this?
No, it was quite unnatural. The movement of the 60s.
Right. How were you affected by that?
Caused a real upheaval and explosion in black radio, that is, radio that was directed towards a black audience. I'm not talking about ownership, I'm talking about who the audience, the intended audience is. So there were a little over 100 black radio stations in the early 60s, but with the explosion of
mainly in the South?
Wherever there were black folks, and black folks
Major
disproportionately
cities.
in the South, of course.
Right.
Half of the black population was in the South. Black people were demanding that they be represented in the airwaves. They wanted something to listen to. And so the number of radio stations increased dramatically as business people responded to that demand. And the people weren't just demanding music and to hear black voices on the air. They wanted information about what black people were doing, what the movement was doing. There was a demand for more than just a black sound, but black information. And so we saw that by the late 60s, even small stations in places like Sparta, Georgia, felt compelled to have at least one full-time news reporter. So all of a sudden, in the space of less than half of a decade, we saw many hundreds of new, mostly young, black radio reporters whose job then was to decide what the hell is black news, or what is the black world view, what is interesting to black folks and how should it be presented, who is important in this oppressed community that's trying to shake off the shackles and therefore has different kinds of organizations than communities that are not oppressed and not in movement. And so we had to make up what black news was as we went along. And that's what I was trying to describe to you when I arrived in 1970 in Augusta, Georgia. Who is important? Is it those people, those reverends and bishops on the wall, or the real leadership of Black Augusta? And we began talking.
How did they first react to you? Were they excited? They were just had so much to say. Were they a little wary, or how? What was those initial contacts?
I within 10 days or 2 weeks had put together 10 folks who were the natural leaders of Black Augusta, who were performing those grassroots leadership functions. That is, the people whose opinion influenced the opinions of others. And I called them informally. Nobody knew this. I called them my 10, my committee of 10. What was really inspiring about this whole process was that within no time at all, these folks who had not been called upon to give their analysis and assessment and their political direction by any media, all of a sudden were in WRDW's newscast, the ones that I put together, on a daily and weekly basis. That is, every newscast had one or more of those committee of 10 people. Right. So here they were, not just the informal leaders of their circles, but every black person. And remember, this was the black radio station. That meant that 90+% of black people in Augusta listened to it. And so here was basically the whole of Black Augusta listening to Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so expounding on the situation as they saw it and proposing actions to change the political complexion of Augusta. They became leaders in that different sense than they were, and they rose to the occasion. They started acting like public leaders rather than of the street or project variety.
And how did these so-called public leaders that you had ripped off the names from on the wall. How did
They
they
were
respond to this?
constantly, the preachers.
Yeah, the preachers.
They were
Well,
constantly lobbying to get back on. That is, those who pretended to be of a more progressive and activist bent. And within a month or so, those that deserved to be back on the air because they were willing to speak to the issues rather than just maintain their relationship with the white power structure, as most of preacherdom was most concerned to do, they got on the air. They were not the Committee of 10, but they were called upon. This hooked me on doing this very poorly paying job. James Brown did not pay good wages, although he wanted you to wear a suit and a tie every day, which was difficult for me because I'd just gotten out of the Army and they had clothed and fed me for 3 years.
I got you. All right. Well, that's where he was at. I got you. So you get out of the Army and 1970. So this is the turmoil, the uprisings of the 60s, and the struggles within the black community, the Panthers. You identified with some of the struggles there. Who were your influences as well from the movements?
Well, Malcolm was everybody's influence.
In particular, right?
And I think that Malcolm was the most important figure of the 60s. I think in many ways more important than King, because this is what Malcolm did. Malcolm gave permission for black folks to critique in mixed company, that is, with white folks listening, to give a critique of those who purported to be the leaders of black America, and whom corporate media seemed to recognize or prop up, depending on how you're looking at it, as leaders of black America. And this occurred dramatically in the run-up to the 1963 March on Washington, which Malcolm, who was still in the Nation of Islam at the time, called the farce on Washington. Right. And what Malcolm did is he questioned their motives. He questioned their relationship with the embodiment of the power structure, the Kennedys. When they went into meetings in the White House or in White House-controlled territory, he would raise the question, what are you doing behind closed doors with those people? You see, he made them accountable in ways that they had not been called upon to be accountable before, and he made it acceptable for black folks to interrogate those who purported to be the leadership. And if Malcolm had not done that, we wouldn't have had that great political opening within the black community, in which this torrent of ideas about how we're going to get free, and who's doing what wrong and what right, and all of these pent-up emotions and energies, we would not have had permission internally in the black community to do that. So Malcolm's stance set the stage for the great debate, some of which turned actually bloody. Things that are important, people get upset about, and do things that might,
but necessary
in hindsight,
confrontation.
they're necessary confrontation
Between King as well.
With King. Everybody had to be accountable. Everybody had a say. Everybody had to back up what they said. And that's what makes the 60s so unique compared to the eras that came before and since, with the crushing of the black liberation movement and the rise of this compliant but very greedy black misleadership class.
Yeah, I think that's a very important historical overview that you've given us here. I think the audience can really understand much better now the subsequent criticisms of the Obama administration, Colin Powell the debate you've had with Michael, Eric Dyson, Condoleezza Rice, and so on. So you've carried on that tradition into the present debate today. And tell us a little, I know
that's the mandate and the obligation that Malcolm and those who came
that you feel very strongly, obviously,
gave
about,
to
yeah,
us.
That gave it to us, absolutely.
And we can't squander that. We know what happens when we stop doing that. By default, the corporate forces in America, and they are more hegemonic than they have ever been, decide who the leadership is, decide what the parameters of debate and conversation are, decide now what's fact and what's not.
And of course, you're going to get pushback by people in your community as well to some of the criticisms you've had with Black Lives Matter, with Obama. So tell us a little about that, your debate with Eric Dyson, for example, and the struggles you've had trying to get the black community to understand what the Obama administration, the misleadership of that administration has been for.
Well, Michael Eric Dyson is just a courtier or a courtier seeking a court that will have him. So he's not really that important, and his MO is not really different from much of the rest of the black misleadership class and the aspiring black misleadership class. So our problem is with the system. Our problem is secondarily with those agents of the system who are black. And so my problem with Michael Eric Dyson was the Obama policies as he defended them, not with. I don't want to big up Michael Eric Dyson.
It's the system that. So we're searching for these alternatives, and you don't see it in particular. I know we talked before the show. Your recent article concerning Bernie Sanders, and we had the national coordinator for the Draft Bernie People's Party on last week's show, Nick Barney. So you have come down pretty hard on. Very hard on the possibility of that being any sort of liberating movement as well, correct?
Well, actually, it came down very hard on Bernie Sanders.
Right.
I actually have empathy, sympathy for folks who were trying to start an alternative party of any kind in this straitjacket of a system, of an oligarchic duopoly. So I'm not.
The idea of a people's party. I understand.
I
understand.
We was predicting, and I think the predictions were valid then and have use now. A year ago, that we will see a realignment, that there will be a social democratic party in the United States, that social democratic politics actually should command a plurality of folks in the United States.
Particularly young people.
Yeah, and a bunch of old people. You have to, the party must define itself. Everything is definition.
Right.
And we said that it may well not be the Green Party, which is involved in redefining itself now, but will come out of a number of efforts, attempts.
By
there will be a
progressive
lot of them to try to do this very difficult thing in a society in which the ruling class, the corporate folks, really do have hegemonic powers and the ability to snuff out even discussion of an alternative, or even the idea of there being an alternative, who have the power to rob us of our vocabularies. So we can't put together a coherent sentence that leads to alternative parties. But yeah, I think that the biggest block of voters in the country is social democratic. I believe, as others do, that the black community, the politics of the black community, more resembles Swedish social democrats, the people that Bernie Sanders seems to admire so much. Right. Than any black folks more resemble that politics than any other group in the country. And many, many black people are way to the left of Swedish social democracy. But how does one organize in a society in which the ruling class, the bankers mainly, have hegemonic sway?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you too. I mean, you are so involved in, as you say, the black left. I mean, are there parties out there? You mentioned the Green Party. You're waiting to see what happens with the People's Party, possible.
The People's Party will fail in terms of their immediate goal of getting Bernie Sanders to be their standard bearer. That ain't going to happen. I'm really at a loss as to why they believe that. He had an opportunity.
Well, they're pretty convinced, I think, that he will.
They are convinced, certainly, which really staggers my mind. As if they know something that I don't, and they certainly have not told everybody. I haven't seen anything that would convince me that, A, that Bernie Sanders is willing to give up the spot that, in terms of some political influence, is probably at the second most important Democrat in the country. He certainly is a Democrat. He's the outreach Democrat. He's the Democrat, an official Democrat for everybody who might be wondering if they should be a Democrat. He's the second most important Democrat in the country, and by all measures, the most popular politician in the country. So he's not suffering popular-wise by remaining a Democrat. He's got outsized influence as a Democrat. He ain't going to go with the with this new party.
Playing with the system.
And I'm convinced of that, and they have never offered anything that
indicates otherwise.
Indicates otherwise. Yeah. But the other question is, if you're progressive, why do you want Bernie Sanders? We called Bernie Sanders an imperialist pig because he is. And we used the big pejorative pig because we wanted to provoke the conversation. And we succeeded. It was our biggest issue in like six months. But the reason that Bernie Sanders didn't talk much about foreign policy during his primary campaign is because he knew that many of his supporters are peace-minded people, and that they would not like to hear what he was prepared to say about foreign policy. And every time he did open his mouth about foreign policy, he sounded like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama.
Dangerous world.
And Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama picked up and expanded the imperial mission that had faltered with the defeat of George W. Bush in Iraq. Obama saved that imperial project, expanded it, 7 wars in various countries in the world, declaring war on the rule of law itself. And
also pacifying any possible anti-war movement.
Yes, and he did that
particularly within the black community.
He did that within his personal skills, and of course the black community. The black community, certainly the black misleadership class, but even more militant elements in the community, were totally neutralized by the rise of the first black president. It was a shock to the black polity. And it's really too early now to make an assessment of whether we'll get over it. Right.
And coupled with that, of course, is the hyper militarization of the police, the increased mass incarceration state, and so on, particularly affecting the black community. So it's another
Barack Obama
part of that.
Increased 24-fold the Pentagon's transfers of weapons and other systems to local police. 24-fold. I mean, it was a far bigger surge in that domestic war than his surge in the Afghanistan war. And yet there was no complaint, virtually no complaint in Black America. In fact, in June of 2014, a bill was submitted in the Congress that would have prohibited the Pentagon from transferring weapons and training and such to local police. 80% of the Congressional Black Caucus, that is 32 of the 40 Black Caucus members who can vote on the floor of the House, voted against that bill to prohibit those 1033 transfers. 4 out of 5 Black Congresspersons.
Maxine Waters, Connors?
Conyers and Maxine Waters voted correctly, but
Right.
only
Okay.
8 did.
8 did. Amazing. Yeah, that's it.
And that would not have happened had Obama been anything but black.
A burgeoning movement with Reverend William Barber. He's calling for a moral revolution in the country. Organizing, preparing for a new Poor People's Campaign, which is set to get really going and active right now. But Mother's Day, there's going to be a period of 40 days of constant pressure and presumably arrests, demonstrations, and so on. In a sense, bringing back what King was attempting to do before he got assassinated. What do you make of that? What do you, as you're creating, or not, I should say, looking out there and trying to define the narrative in a sense, what do you think about this burgeoning movement as a possibility of making some links progressives have had difficulties doing? Talking about this as a moral issue, economic issue, political, cultural. Are we ready for this, or what do you think?
Well, I've met Reverend Barber and spent a little time with him, and he's an impressive and extremely talented and intelligent and sincere and effective guy. And people that I trust assure me that folks around Reverend Barber are genuine progressives, leftists. That we're not talking about some kind of NAACP kinds of politics with simply a more talented kind of practitioner.
Some of those ministers you ripped off on the wall there.
Right, yeah, right. He was not one of them.
No, he's not. Absolutely.
I might have ripped his name off the wall too if he appeared with them, but he would have gone back on.
Yeah, I understand.
Back on the air immediately.
Right.
And I have to say that there are many NAACPs. There are some reactionary chapters, and there are some chapters that are, relatively speaking, progressive. And North Carolina has been among those progressive states in terms of the NAACP, and I'm sure that he has something to do with it. He's left the NAACP because the NAACP has its corporate connections. He didn't tell me that. He didn't say that. I read that,
right,
because we understand how the NAACP operates and its financial dependence on corporations like Walmart and others. They sleep with the enemy a lot. And so it's a good thing that Reverend Barber has left the NAACP. It's an indicator, as far as I'm concerned, that he wants to have more latitude to strike out at the forces that oppress us, especially in terms of economic forces.
You like his strategy of fusion politics? You think we can?
There is no, I'm a revolutionary.
You're a revolutionary, okay.
I'm a revolutionary black nationalist and a Marxist,
okay.
and there is no contradiction whatsoever. And there's
Help us understand that a little more.
Well, you have to, if you're going to talk about fusion, fusions don't just happen by some kind of chemical reaction
Right.
when folks get in proximity.
Right.
Human social organization is not like that, especially
conflict.
in a thoroughly racist society like we have. And so it's a simple matter. One can support fusion type politics in various circumstances while still being a revolutionary black nationalist who sees their job primarily as organizing within the black community. Who is going to fuse with whom? What organizations are going to fuse with what other organizations? You have to have an organization in order to have a meaningful conversation, or it's just a bunch of individuals talking. So there's
But
no
isn't it
contradiction.
also about transforming?
I don't want to see some kind of dichotomy between
No, I
fusion
understand.
and people who are
No, I
revolutionary
understand.
black nationalists.
But how do we heal? How do we begin to transform people? That, I think, is another message that Reverend Barber talks about. Of course, Cornell talks about West, radical love. How does that fit in to the analysis, the black left, the international black left? How does that fit into bringing peace in the Middle East? I know we're jumping here, and we unfortunately just have a few more minutes, but we are in such need in the entire world, of course, of healing. Traumatized people, Palestinians, Israelis.
One shows your love
for
the rest of humanity by doing everything you can to alleviate the oppression of your fellow human beings. You don't just pledge love, you act lovingly to eliminate those forces that stop people from acting their most human selves. We're discovering what humanity is. That's what progress is. That's what civilization is. The discovery of the possibilities and maybe limitations of what this human organism
Freedom
is.
As Richie Havens
Well, we
was saying.
define that too. We're back to that definition process that we began with.
Absolutely.
We'll argue about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But Barber seems to be the only figure, black or white or whatever, who seems to get that in the American political culture at this point. That has a possibility of bringing people together in a way that I don't think we've been brought together since the 60s.
Well, as an analyst, I would have to say brought together around what issues for what purpose, and that's what Black Agenda Report
Absolutely.
would be talking about.
To bring about that progressive agenda, which both you and I met him, Reverend Barber too, I'm convinced that this is what he's about. And unfortunately, just in a couple of minutes we have left, tell our audience how they can hear more from you, and where can they listen to and read more about your work.
Well, in a nutshell, Black Agenda Report is a weekly publication. It comes out every Wednesday. We would hope it would be early on Wednesday, but sometimes it's later on Wednesday than it should be, but every Wednesday. And it consists of a bunch of articles written mainly by our editors, and some aggregated stories.
Bruce Dixon.
Bruce Dixon, Margaret
Nellie Bailey.
Kimberly, Nellie Bailey, Marsha Coleman Adebayo, Ajamu Baraka, the former vice presidential
We've had on the show
candidate.
twice. Yeah.
Well, he's an editor and a columnist for Black Agenda Report. He didn't get to contribute much last year because he was doing other things. But yes, he's part of our collective, if we could use that word.
Please. And I just wish we had a lot more time. I hope you'll come back. I thoroughly enjoyed having you on the show, and just thank you so very, very much for all you've done.
Thank you.
And for so many years, and continue many, many more years. So thank you again very, very much for being here, Glenn. And thank you all for being here. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. We'll see you next week for Radical Imagination. Thank you.
Bad self, say it loud. I'm thinking I'm proud. loud. Say it loud. Some say it's malice, some say it's a lot of nerve. So we can't quit moving, we get what we deserve. I've been abused, scorned. Talk about baby, sure as you're born. Just as sure as it takes you eyes to make a pair. We can't give up the ship till we get our share. Say it loud. Let me hear you. Say it loud. Say it loud. Say it loud. Ooh-wee, you're killing me. You're out of sight. So tough, you're tough enough. Ooh-wee, you're killing me. You're out. Get our share. Say it loud. Say it. Say it loud. Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. Say it loud. Ooh-wee, you're killing me. All right, you're out of sight. So tough, you're tough enough. Soul train! Say it loud, soul train! Say it loud! Get on the train! Get on the train! Woo! Say it louder! Say it loud! Say it loud! get it.